The Vikings and the Muslim Scholar. Produced by D.W. Draffy. The date is the 21st of June, 922. Baghdad is the largest city in the world, with a population around 500,000, and the 18th Caliph al-Muqtadir is presiding over the twilight of the mighty Abbasid Caliphate. Focused more on palace intrigues and the delights of the court than the governance of his empire, the Caliph was challenged many times throughout his long reign and even briefly deposed. But as Baghdad's political and economic power wanes, and its military demands a greater and greater share of its budget, a flowering of culture and education persists, giving rise to great thinkers, writers, philosophers, and proto-scientists whose innovations are fundamental to the modern world. But on this day, in June, the Caliph is sending a minor diplomatic mission to a vassal king of the Khazar Khaganate in the far north of his empire. This vassal king, or Iltabir al-Mish, is likely the first of the Volga kings who is Muslim, and he has requested help from Baghdad. Headed by the eunuch ambassador Sasan al-Rasi and accompanied by the freemen Tikin the Turk and Bars the Saklab, the Caliph's delegation is tasked with an even more important evangelical and theological mission. Spread the word of Islam and teach the proper usage of Sharia law throughout the newly converted Bulgars dwelling on the eastern bank of the Volga River. The head religious officer for this mission is Aḥmad ibn Faḍlān. We know nothing about his life, except that he is a faqih, or jurist of Islamic law. But he kept a detailed account of their long journey to the north, and after possessing nothing but fragments for nearly 1,000 years, an intact text was found 100 years ago in a museum in Iran. His account is one of the earliest descriptions that have survived of the people in that region. The delegation travels east along the old Khorasan road to Rai and Nishapur, then across the river Oxus toward Bukhara in Central Asia. There they are to receive a promised 4,000 dinars for a disputed property from Bukhara's ruler, the Samanid ruler Nasr bin Ahmad. But the Abbasid owner of the property, Ahmad bin Musa, is arrested at the border, and the 4,000 dinars is never paid. The lack of these funds will play a great part in their tale later on. The delegation waits 28 days for bin Musa, unaware that he has been detained. Winter is setting in. The Caliph's embassy decides they cannot wait any longer, and they hire a boat to take them up the Oxus, nearly 1,000 kilometers, to the city of Kath in Khwarazm. Here, Ibn Faḍlān's companion Tikin the Turk is prevented from entering the city or crossing their lands. He is known to them, and has supported their foes, the nomadic Turkish tribes to the north, with shipments of weapons. By the time they have won through, winter has come. December and January on the steppe is fierce. He writes, "We lived in a landscape where a gate to the cold of hell seemed to have opened." Most of the Islamic jurists and tutors abandon the embassy and retreat south to Baghdad. Only a handful of the most senior emissaries remain to carry out the mission to the Bulgars. He tells us, "The friendly locals urged us to bring far more clothing than we otherwise would. We are glad they did. What they described was only half as bad as it ended up being." Crossing modern-day Kazakhstan over the month of March, swaddled in so many clothes they literally couldn't move, the delegation finally arrives in the grazing lands of the Oghuz Turks. Ibn Faḍlān's observations and documentation of their animist traditions preserves all we know about them before their conversion to Islam. For example, he writes that although adultery among them is virtually unknown, if a man is convicted of it, they will tie his limbs to the bent branches of 2 trees, then release the branches so that the adulterer is torn in half lengthwise. He writes in detail about the Oghuz, the Khazars, the Pechenegs along the Ural River, and the Bashkirs of the interior. After fording 7 more rivers and meeting many more peoples, the embassy finally arrives in the lands of the Bulgars on 12th May, 922. Here Ibn Faḍlān learns that he was right to warn his leaders that the lack of 4,000 dinars would doom their enterprise. Almish badgers them relentlessly for the money, not believing their account of how it was never given to them. The clever king begins to refer to Ibn Faḍlān with the name of the first caliph Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, or Abu Bakr the Truthful, in a slight against his honesty. Their embassy with Almish is not without its victories, although he is displeased that they do not bring the funds for a fortress that might defend these converted lands. He understands well enough that his decision to turn away from his rabbinical masters of the Khazar Khaganate to the Abbasid caliphs is a wise one, and he formally changes his name to Jafar ibn Abdallah. It is after their departure that the caliph's delegation meets the people of Russia along the banks of the Volga, known by him as the Atil River north of the Caspian, variously described as Vikings, people of Rus or Russia, people of Kievan Rus, Varangians, or Scandinavians. These merchants live upon their boats and ships, trading goods and slaves at markets and kingdoms throughout the region. The identity of these merchants has been a great matter of academic dispute reaching back to the 18th century, with compelling arguments made by 2 distinct camps. The Normanists, who contend that modern Russia and Ukraine were first developed into modern nation-states by Finns and Scandinavians and Vikings, who had first sailed across the Baltic through the mouth of the Volga and down its length, and those who have challenged this view, who are known as anti-Normanists. They champion a more Slavic, indigenous source for the origins of Rus. In this adaptation, we choose to follow the excellent example of James E. Montgomery, who uses Ibn Faḍlān's own use of the term Russia, or people of the wider region of Rus. The purpose of this adaptation is to provide a clear, accessible version of Ibn Faḍlān's account while still preserving textual accuracy. Following the account, I'll speak more about its details and the context of the events it describes. Adaptation. Upon the banks of the river Atil, I saw the Russia for the first time. These were traders on an expedition. As physical specimens, they were perfect, tall as palm trees, their reddish hair and fair skin never covered by a tunic or kaftan. Instead, the men wear cloaks draped from one shoulder, leaving the opposite arm free. They are armed at all times, with axes, swords, and daggers at their belts. The blades of the swords are broad and ridged in the Frankish style. Lines of dark green ink cover each man's skin from his neck down to his toes, displaying pictures and patterns like mosaics in a church. The women wear elaborate cloak pins upon their breasts. These small discs are made of either iron, copper, silver, or gold, depending on the wealth and status of her husband. Hanging from these discs by rings are daggers. Wealthy women wear bands of gold and silver around their necks. When their husband's wealth reaches 10,000 dirhams, one of these bands is crafted for his wife. 20,000 dirhams earns the wife 2 bands, and another band for every 10,000 more. The wealthiest women wear many bands around their necks. But what the women prize the most are dark green ceramic beads they keep safe aboard their boats. 1 dirham buys a single bead, which they string together and wear as another sign of wealth. Of all Allah's creatures, these men and women are certainly the filthiest. They never wash themselves after urinating or defecating or after sexual relations. They don't even wash their hands after eating. They remind me most of asses wandering untethered in the field. On the banks of the Atil, they have built large wooden houses beside their moored boats. Upon arriving, they gather by the score in a single dwelling. Within, each has a raised platform and a couch upon which he sits to conduct his business and pleasure. Beautiful slave girls wait upon them. These girls are available for trade, or even public acts of sex with the men who own them, which they all participate in while the others look on, or even join in. Entire groups can perform sexual acts before each other. I have seen a merchant purchase a slave girl from another man while he is having sex with her, but the transaction will be delayed until the man has finished. Also, they do wash their faces and hands when they must, but only in the most polluted water imaginable. Picture this. Each morning, a slave girl arrives with a large basin filled with water. She hands it to her master, and he washes his hands and face and hair in it. He dips his comb in the water and brushes his hair. He blows his nose in the water. He spits in it. There is no impurity too great for this water. Once he is done, his slave girl takes the basin to the next man, and he goes through the same cleaning ritual. Around the entire long house the basin goes, from one man to the next. Each of them blows his nose and spits into it, then washes his face and hair with it. Their boats glide up to the dock, with the men aboard waiting at the rail, ready to instantly disembark. In their hands they carry many goods. These are food offerings of meat and bread, onions and milk and nabi alcoholic drinks. They are meant for a tall wooden post of an idol, with the face of a man, set into the ground and surrounded by figurines and wooden planks with carved faces. These idols await the returning traders. Upon reaching them, a man will prostrate himself before the largest idol, declaring, "Lord, I come from a distant land, with this many slave girls priced at this price, and this many sables priced at this price per pelt." Then he lists all the rest of his merchandise for the idol, ending it with the ceremonial offering of food and drink. "I have brought you this gift, Lord," he says, placing it before the idol. Then he prays, "Bless me with a merchant rich with dinars and dirhams. Lord, may he be agreeable and buy from me all that I wish to sell, without haggling." This god of commerce is central to his trade here on the banks of the Atil. If his business is slow, or he has trouble selling all he wishes, he will return to the idol with a second or third offering. But if he still cannot trade as he wishes, he will start to bring offerings to the figurines and other idols, extolling them as the wives and daughters and sons of his lord. Each of these figures is appealed to, with the trader imploring them for their support by groveling before them. If his trade is a success, quick and easy and profitable, then a trader will declare, "As my transactions have profited, so shall my lord." And he fills the area with sheep and cows he has bought. After slaughtering them, he donates a portion of the meat to charity and casts the rest of it before the idols. He hangs the heads of the cows and sheep from the tall post of the idol and leaves it overnight. Dogs come and eat the meat from the skulls, but when the man wakes in the morning, he says, "My lord is pleased with me and my trade and has eaten all I offer." If one of these Russia traders falls ill, they are sent to live in a tent far from the others with nothing but bread and water. None come to visit. None contact him in any way, especially if he is low in social standing or a slave. If he recovers and departs the tent on his own 2 feet, he will rejoin his fellows. If he dies, they bury him. If he was a slave, his body remains where it fell, food for the dogs and birds. Bandits and thieves are brought to a tall tree. Their captors tie a rope around their necks and hang them, leaving the corpse there until the rope breaks, rotted away by the wind and rain. I hadn't seen a chieftain die, but they told me that the least that is done for them is cremation, and usually much more. Eager to see this, when I learned of the death of one of their great men, I went to observe their ceremonies. First, they place his body in a grave, and cover it with a canopy for 10 days, while they craft and sew his funeral garments. For a poor man's death, they will build him a modest boat on the land, place the body inside, and burn it until it is ash. In the case of the chieftain, however, his family will gather all his belongings and divide them into thirds. His wife and children will retain 1/3. 1/3 will be used as his funeral garments, and 1/3 will be sold for alcohol. They are addicted to alcohol and drink it from morning until night. Sometimes one of them will even die with the cup still in his hand. Upon his death, his family asks of his slave boys and girls, "Which of you will die with him?" And some of them will reply, "I shall." This is a sacred compact, and once uttered, it is impossible for the slave to recant their promise, even though it is known for some to try. When the chieftain died, whose ceremonies I witnessed, they asked his slave girls who would die with him. One said, "I shall." Now, under the care of 2 other slave girls, this sacrificial girl is accompanied everywhere and treated with care. They even wash her feet with their own hands while she drinks all she can stomach and celebrates carefree. These slave girls also attend the dead man, helping his kin to prepare his clothes and his entire funerary arrangement. We arrived at this ceremony on the day the chieftain was to be burned, with the slave girl on his ship. I was surprised to learn that the ship had been drawn from the water onto the land, where 4 planks of kadank birch had been erected to hold its keel. Other planks were arranged about this structure as a giant pyre. Then a pavilion was built on the ship's deck, and the entire vessel was hauled up and placed atop the keel planks. To prepare for the next ceremony, mourners circled the boat, uttering words I did not understand. As the body of the chieftain still remained buried in its grave, they brought forth a couch for him and placed it in position in the pavilion aboard the ship. Then a woman arrived known as the Angel of Death. She covered the couch in precious quilts and cushions made of Byzantine silk brocade. I saw her with my own eyes. A gloomy, heavy-set woman of indeterminate years. The Angel of Death directed others to sew his garments up and prepare the corpse while she readied the death of the slave girl. Now they went to the grave and dug it up. The chieftain was still dressed in the izar in which he died. I saw that his skin had turned black from being stored in the cold ground, but at least I could not smell him. I watched as the mourners removed gifts of nabi, fruit, basil, and a drum from his grave. Then they removed the body and clothed it in ceremonial trousers and ran leggings, boots, a kurtak, and a silk kaftan with gold buttons. Atop his head they placed a sable-fringed kalansawa turban. Bringing him to the ship they had prepared for him, the mourners hoisted his body up into the structure and rested him in the pavilion on the quilts of the couch, propping him up with cushions. First they brought alcohol, fruit, and herbs and placed them with him. Then they brought bread, meat, and onions. They killed one of his dogs and cut it in half, throwing it onto the ship, and then placed all the chieftain's weapons with his body. Then they brought out 2 sacrificial horses. They had these mounts gallop until they worked up a lather, then they killed them and hacked their flesh into pieces with their swords. They threw these on board, and then did the same to 2 cows. Finally, a cock and a hen were killed and cut into pieces, and they were also thrown aboard. As this occurred, the slave girl who had volunteered to die wandered the wider area, in and out of pavilions that each man had erected. In each, the pavilion's owner would have intercourse with the slave girl, which would end with the words, "Tell your master that I have done this purely out of your love for him." For Friday's evening prayer, the mourners brought the slave girl to a wooden frame they had built for the ceremony. Like a door frame standing on the earth, They lifted her high above it with her feet in their upraised hands. She looked over the frame and said something ceremonial. They brought her down, then lifted her up again, where she seemed to repeat her words. After the third time they handed her a knife and a hen, and she cut off its head. They threw the pieces of this sacrifice onto the ship as well. I have an interpreter for all these events. I asked him what she said, and he told me, the first time they lifted her, she said, "Behold, I see my father and mother." The second time she said, "Behold, I see all my dead kin seated before me." And the last time she said, "Behold, I see my master seated in paradise. Paradise is beautiful and verdant. He is accompanied there by all his fallen companions and his male slaves. He summons me now. Bring me to him." The slave girl removed 2 bracelets she wore and presented them to the angel of death. Then, to the young slave girls who served her, now known as the daughters of the angel of death, she gifted her anklets. The mourners carried the slave girl to the ship and handed her to the angel of death. Standing on its deck outside the ship's pavilion, men joined them wielding sticks and shields. They handed her a cup of nabi. She chanted over the cup, then drank it. My interpreter told me, thus does she bid her female companions farewell. She was handed a second cup. She chanted over it for a much longer time. The angel of death urged the slave girl to drink it and enter the pavilion, but she was too intoxicated to do so. She only placed her head inside the pavilion, while her body remained stretched outside. So the angel of death grabbed her by the head and dragged her entirely into the pavilion. They disappeared within together. Now the men began to bang their shields with the sticks to drown out her screams. It was explained that if the other slave girls heard her suffering, they would not volunteer to die with their masters. 6 men entered the pavilion to have intercourse with the slave girl. Then they laid her down beside the body of her master, and 2 of them took hold of her feet and 2 her hands. The angel of death tied both ends of a rope around her neck, and then the 2 remaining men pulled at the rope while she took out a dagger. She thrust it into the ribs of the slave girl again and again as the 2 men strangled her to death. The chieftain's closest kin was a man who now approached the ship and lit a piece of wood. Completely naked, with one hand holding the torch aloft and the other hand covering his anus, he turned his back to the ship and faced the people. He approached the ship in this way, facing away from it. Now that the slave girl was dead, even more wood was added to its pyre. Then he turned once again to the ship and ignited it. Now all the mourners came forward with torches and firewood. Each one threw their torch atop the pyre. The firewood combusted, then the ship, and finally the pavilion with the dead bodies and the grave goods they contained. A dreadful wind arose, feeding the flames, and the pyre roared. One of the Russia mourners standing beside me spoke to my interpreter about me. I asked him what the man had said, and he translated. He told me, "These Arabs are fools," and I asked him why he said so. He replied, "Because you intentionally take those who are nearest and dearest to you and those whom you serve and admire, and dig a hole in the earth and throw them in. Your loved ones are eaten by the earth, by vermin and worms to linger in darkness. We burn our loved ones with fire and release them immediately to paradise." Then he laughed at you. But I wanted to know more. I asked him about the details of this chieftain's entry into paradise, and the mourner responded that it was clear their lord loved the dead man, for he sent a strong wind to feed the flames and take him away within the hour. And in truth it did not take a whole hour before the ship, the pyre, the master, and the slave girl were all reduced to a fine ash. Then they labored to build a hillock of earth over the site. When it was done, they planted a birch plank in its crown, on which they wrote the chieftain's name and the name of the king of Rus. After that, they all departed. It is the custom of the king of Rus to keep his closest 400 companions with him in his palace. They are the bravest and most trusted men in his kingdom, and when he dies, they die with him, offering their protection in the afterlife. In paradise, each of them has 2 slave girls. One serves him and washes him and feeds him, while the other has sexual intercourse with him, all in a great crowd around the foot of their lord's gigantic throne, decorated with precious stones. The king has 40 slave girls sitting with him, who are all for his sexual pleasure. He never leaves his throne, relieving himself in a salver. If he wishes to ride, they bring his steed to the throne, and he goes for a ride throughout the landscape. Then, when it is time to dismount, he only does so back onto his throne. The king has a vice-regent in death, who leads his army and defends the kingdom from all enemies, standing in for the king among his subjects so that the departed ruler can enjoy his afterlife. This is all Ibn Faḍlān has to say on the subject of the Rus and the Vikings. He next turns his attention to their time among the Khazars. Although there is no account of the end of their journey, it is recorded in Baghdad that the Bulgars sent emissaries and pilgrims for the Hajj, so it seems the embassy of al-Rasi and Ibn Faḍlān wasn't a total disaster. Aḥmad ibn Faḍlān was himself a mysterious character. We know nothing of his background, and all we learn of him is what he tells us himself. Long considered ethnically Arab, modern scholars are careful to point out that no such details exist in the historical record. All we can say is that he has an insightful and peculiarly modern sensibility, even in relation to other Islamic travelers such as Ibn Battuta, who lived nearly 4 centuries later. Ibn Faḍlān speaks in a dispassionate and objective voice, even when describing things he finds appalling, outrageous, and offensive. From the reports of his dialogues with kings and sovereigns, we know he had a quick wit and palpable sense of humor. He also braved the extremes of the journey better than most, and hardly ever seemed to complain. An entire episode could be dedicated to the provenance of these Rus peoples he observed. The academic disputes over their cultural details, traditions, and rituals are infamous. It is safe to say that despite the great progress being made in understanding the details of 10th century Central Asia, that exactly what comprised a Varangian or a Russia trader remains a mystery. It is quite likely that, with all we have recently learned of the ethnic diversity of Vikings, that they follow less of a straightforward lineage than we have thought. In fact, in a 2020 Nature paper led by famed geneticist Eske Willerslev that sequenced over 400 Viking-age corpses, they learned that Viking identity was not limited to people with Scandinavian genetic ancestry. The study shows the genetic history of Scandinavia was influenced by foreign genes from Asia and southern Europe before the Viking Age. So even though the pigmentation and other physical attributes of the Russia Ibn Faḍlān encountered indicates that they were ethnically quite different from the Turk, Khazar, and Pecheneg populations, they were not the symbols of racial purity some people would like to think they were. By the 10th century, the Viking Age was over 100 years old, and their infamous raiding parties had done much to mix heritages and haplogroups into more modern combinations. I encourage you to find a complete translation of Aḥmad ibn Faḍlān's works. He describes a long-lost world in Central Asia of forgotten kingdoms and religions, cultural details that are as alien and shocking to us as they were to him, and a vibrant landscape of fierce people living along the banks of the river Volga.